All right, so the first question is describe to me how you feel about the different learning types.
So I want you to first define what you're meaning by learning types to me.
Learning types like the visuals, the physical, verbal, all those types, like they're different and in a way that they make a student and a person kind of like in their unique way of learning.
Yeah. So I feel, so I'm sure you know from class, I study individual differences, right? Personality and how personality affects kind of how we see our environment. So I'm a firm believer that there are individual differences in how we learn, right? So people differ in how they take in information, how they process that information, and how well they retain that information. I think that even though there are individual differences, that people can still learn from all of those processes, right? Like even if you're a visual learner, you can still learn from verbal stuff, right? It just takes longer. So it's really a kind of how quickly you learn the information. Some people learn information more quickly if they see it in a certain type of way. And that's really what I think about the learning styles, like how it works for my mind, I think.
All right. As a professor, express how you feel about different learning types being in lecture halls.
Oh, that's a good question. So you want to know how I use it or how I think people should use it?
You can do both.
Okay. So I would say, like, for me, I try to do a couple of different things, and I haven't been as good about it this semester because of my leg, but so a lot of our in-class activities is because people learn through doing and self-relevant, right? So they kind of work through a problem or they discuss it in a group, and they're more, I mean, it's designed to be more, a little bit more hands-on and a little bit more verbal, like, you know, I guess doing, right? Hands-on and kind of more doing. Whereas my lecture is a lot more verbal, right? And so people are kind of that. But I also try to make my slides kind of, well, I don't do much for visual. I don't think I do much for visual learners, right? Like people who actually need to see things. Like I don't show a lot of videos. So maybe I'm not doing my students a service. But I think it's a great idea because I know what I do is try to reinforce everything I say in multiple different ways, right? So, you know, from lecture, I kind of give the definition or talk about a theory, and then I give an example, and then I reiterate that example using kind of a personal life story. And I do those three different things because people kind of will retain that information differently, right? Like some people just want the definitional stuff and want what's on the slide, and that's what they focus on. Some people really need the example to be able to understand it and to apply it, right? Because that's more kind of hands-on-y kind of doing. And other people will learn better with like more comedy or personal life, or we know that people, regardless of your learning style, making something self-relevant, like relevant to you, will actually help you remember it better because then it just becomes more important to you, right? Like when you think about something, like when I use that example of kind of expectancy theory and going and figuring out what your GPA would be with all your different, you know, like people tend to be able to understand expectancy theory at that moment because it becomes, oh, I've done that before. I know what that is, right? And so it becomes more important. So I do try to reinforce all of that in multiple different ways so that different people and different learning styles actually do it. But I think it's important. I think reiteration and as many different ways as you can do one thing means that you're just going to get more people in that way.
All right. Can you describe the attention span of different learning types that you see in like your class or just in a regular day basis?
That's a good question. I think overall attention span is shorter than it used to be, and I think there's a lot of research that does that. I feel, so this is what I'd say. I feel like people who are verbal, like who like listening and kind of being told, those are the people that pay attention to me in lecture. Let's put it that way. But then when we're doing activities, I feel like the people who are more hands-on learners, like need to be experiential learners, right? Those are the people who kind of light up and take longer to do the class activities. So I'd say that attention span affects what you're paying attention to, right? Or learning style affects what you're paying attention to and how much attention you pay to that, right? So when it matches your learning style, you're actually more engaged in that activity in the classroom.
As a professor, can you name one or two ways where all learning types can get the same educational aspects from being in a lecture hall?
Yeah. So I think a big thing is I find that the self-relevant stuff is most important, right? So regardless of learning style, when I make it something relevant that's to you, right, or something that you could have experienced or use an example, people tend to kind of perk up and pay more attention, because then whether you're a visual learner, you can picture yourself in that situation, right? Whether you're a verbal learner, you're listening and you hear it, and whether you're hands-on and more experiential, you can think about the experience that you've had and kind of experience that over again in your mind. So I feel like using self-relevant kind of examples is something that most people can actually, regardless of learning style, can actually relate to and pay attention to. So that's one thing I try to do, to kind of reach out to everybody. The other thing is the different types of class activities. The class activities are either work in a group or kind of learn something about yourself or work through a problem, because we'll continue to do some of these as we move on. And so they kind of hit at different types of learning too. So some of them, when you discuss, like when we discussed about who you would fire, right, that was more of a verbal type of thing, right? But when you're kind of filling out the surveys to figure out how much you trust people and things like that, that's more of a, I think, a visualization. So you visualize yourself in that position and things like that. So I'd say those are the two things that I think can reach most people, is kind of more activities and discussion and more self-relevant information.
People with visual or physical learning types might do poorly because it is a lecture type class. Do you think students should change what they do, or professors in a non-biased way?
Yeah, so for you, your use of physical, I'm using experiential, which I think is the same thing. But yeah, I think you do lose a lot of students in lecture-based class, because I think we have more students who are actually physical learners than anything else. So what I used to do in some of my classes, because people are such physical learners, is do what we call active learning. So I haven't done that in this course since I started teaching this course, just because it's short. But I used to teach more 75-minute classes. And you know what happens in 75 minutes is about 35 minutes in, you lose everybody, right? Like, it's just long and it's lecture style and things like that. And so you lose your physical learners and you lose your visualization learners. So what I used to do is break it up, do what I called an intermission, and have students like get up and do jumping jacks. Or if we had an activity where they could use their bodies and learn about what we're doing, we'd use their bodies. So, for example, I used to teach statistics when I was at Iowa. And what I would do is to talk about kind of ANOVA or a scatter plot or correlation or regression, right? I'd group people up by their height, and I'd kind of place them in a line, and and we start using their physical bodies to talk about those statistical processes and those statistical analyses, and they can kind of place themselves in the equation, or place themselves in the line of best fit, or place themselves in the right bar graph, and we can visualize. You can actually visualize the people there, but they're also physically kind of experiencing and moving their body and learning more physically and experientially in that class. And I feel like that helps comprehension, because that hits the learning styles, but I also feel like it's harder to do in classes that are the size of our class, right? That are more lecture-based, because you can't do as much activity. And so maybe I need to do more of that, is what I'm saying. But I think that there are things you can do to keep those students engaged. Like, you do lose them, because in a core class like 330, right, where you have to lecture because they have to learn the concepts, because they're going to go on and take classes after it that might build on it, there has to be some lecture. But I think there's ways that you can have people use their bodies and visualize things in a way that complements it.
And then just